A little bit of background here. Jesus enters the temple courts. This is the courtyard outside the inner sanctuary. It was called the court of the Gentiles because it's the one part of the temple that Gentiles were allowed to be in. And it's in this area that the merchants would sell various things that were necessary for the people to make sacrifices. This is why they came to the temple, because as required by the law, they had to, during Passover and sometimes other times, make sacrifices. And so at this busy time of year, they're all coming to offer up animals and whatnot. And these merchants would sell animals and oils and things of that sort that were necessary for these sacrifices. The money changers were there to exchange currency because the law was that all the currency in the temple had to be Jewish. It had to be Jewish currency, and so they wouldn't use Roman currency. And so people would come, most folks were using the Roman currency, so they would have to turn in their Roman money and get Jewish money in order to pay tithes and things of that sort in the temple. That's all fine, but the problem is that the thing had degenerated over some time into a scam. The priests and the merchants were in cahoots with one another to pocket some extra money. And the way it worked was like this. A family would come and they'd have their sheep or their cattle or their bird or whatever to sacrifice for whatever sins or for whatever reasons. But according to the law, the animal has to be worthy to be sacrificed. It's supposed to be unblemished. And so the priest had to certify that this animal was good enough to be sacrificed. So they'd inspect the animal, and you look at any animal close enough and you're going to find some defect. And so they would find the defect and they say, oh no, this animal can't be offered. You have to go back and buy a temple certified animal from the merchants. So you go back to the merchants and you trade in your animal and then with some extra cash and you get a temple certified animal. Next couple comes and they got their animal and the priest inspects that animal and finds a defect and says, you got to go to the merchants and get a temple certified animal. So they go and they trade in their animal and give some extra cash. And the animal they get was the one that just got traded in. You see, and so the priests and these merchants are making off some good money here on this scam. The money changers had their own little scheme going on. People had to use the Jewish currency, so they had people where they had no other options, and they would charge them for the service of exchanging money. And so you'd give a Roman dollar, but you'd get 50 Jewish cents back, and they would pocket the difference. So there's all this corruption going on. It was really well known at the time. Jesus comes into this situation, and he is enraged. He makes a whip, cracks a whip, turns over the tables, makes quite a scene, interfering with all of that commerce, calling the authorities to bring this temple back to its original purpose, which was to be a house of prayer. This, of course, gets the authorities very, very angry. They are now more intent on killing him, because not only is he a false teacher, as they've always thought, but he is interfering with their livelihood and undermining their authority. And this sets Jesus on a trajectory to get killed. Now, this is the most overt, angry action we find Jesus displaying throughout the Gospels. I mean, he cursed the fig tree, that's true, and he had sometimes pretty harsh words to say to people. But this is the most aggressive we ever see Jesus acting. And so, since our life is to be patterned after him, this is a perfect time to learn on how we are to be angry. And so I want to focus on the anger of Jesus and how he handled it and what he was angry about. A few preliminary points here. One is that I think it's important to know that Jesus wasn't here sort of just having a spontaneous outburst of anger. This wasn't a temper tantrum. He didn't lose control and start turning over tables, because he couldn't control himself. Most scholars agree that this was a premeditated, calculated act for several reasons. One was that the knowledge of the temple corruption was pretty widespread, and most people believed that when the Messiah showed up, one of the things he would do was cleanse the temple. Based on Jeremiah 7 and several other verses, they believe that's one of the things they expected the Messiah to do, was to take back God's temple for Yahweh. And so Jesus is here proclaiming that he is the Messiah because he's fulfilling this expectation. And he was, in fact, Yahweh reclaiming the temple as his own. So Jesus went to the temple for that purpose. Many scholars also argue that this was a premeditated, calculated act in order to force the hands of the authorities against him. Jesus went to Jerusalem to be crucified. And the best way to get yourself crucified in the first century is cause a ruckus in the temple. And so he's really forcing the hand of the authorities to move against him. So it wasn't a spontaneous outburst or anything of the sort. A second thing I think it's important to note as a preliminary observation is this. Some people have tried to use this episode as justification for violence. And they believe that this episode shows that Jesus wasn't unequivocally opposed to violence. And therefore, that justifies them being violent when they feel it's for a good cause. I submit to you that that is reading a whole lot into this text. It does say that he turned over the tables, but that was to free the animals. He was trying to interfere with the commerce of all this, and so he's freeing the sheep and the doves and whatnot by turning over these animals. And it does say he made a whip. But it never says he used the whip on the animals, let alone on people. Throughout history, the best way to control a herd of animals is to crack a whip. And it was just the best way to steer them in a certain direction. He's causing a stampede here, and so he's cracking a whip. But there's no display of violence here. Yes, Jesus is aggressive. Yes, Jesus is angry, but he's not inflicting violence on anyone. His purpose was to embarrass the merchants and embarrass the leaders and force their hand against him, but it wasn't to inflict pain on them. And had he done that, first of all, that would set him in contradiction to all the teachings he's been given about how to never retaliate and to turn the other cheek and to bless those who persecute you and love your enemies and so on and so on. But it also would have got him arrested right on the spot. There's no way he would have got out of there to continue the rest of the week. But he was angry, he was confrontational, he was aggressive. And since he's the Son of God and he's sinless, and he's the example we're to live by, what it tells us is that there is a place for followers of Jesus to sometimes get aggressive, to sometimes get angry, to sometimes get confrontational, to live in love as Christ loved us, which is the fundamental call of the gospel. It does mean we live free of violence, but it doesn't mean we live free of anger. And it certainly doesn't mean that we are always passive and let things just slip by. There's a place sometimes for cracking a whip and for turning over tables. In fact, love requires us. How we need to hear this in Minnesota, Niceville. Love sometimes requires that we get confrontational and get aggressive and confront things that need to be confronted. How we get angry might be sinful. What we get angry about might be sinful, but anger itself is not a sin. Paul says this in Ephesians 4. He says, in your anger, do not sin. Now that statement would make no sense if anger itself was sin. In your anger, do not sin. He assumes you're going to get angry. You should get angry sometimes. But don't sin when you're angry. One of the ways you might sin when you're angry is by disobeying what he says here. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry. Don't go to bed with your anger. Don't sleep on your anger. One of the ways you can sin when you're angry is by not dealing with your anger, by pretending that you're not angry when you really are angry, by just going along with Minnesota nice and smiling and saying praise the Lord when inside there's rage going on. That is sin because that is destructive. In fact, in the very next verse, Paul says, don't give the devil a foothold. And what he's saying here is that when we stuff our anger and pretend like things are okay when they're not okay, we are giving the devil a foothold. It pollutes your life. When you swallow anger, you're swallowing poison. And it seeps in there, it becomes bitterness. It wreaks havoc on you, and it comes out in different ways, whether it's depression or anxiety or even physical symptoms. It's never good for us to pretend on anything, certainly not on anger. Stuffing it is a form of sin. And we often do that in the name of being pious. We think it's Christian to just keep on smiling and never get angry, when in fact the Bible says that that is sin. Anger is a God-given emotion. It is our way of knowing that something that we value has been devalued. When there's something that's precious to you and has been devalued, it's supposed to cause anger. Now, it may be that you're overvaluing something is too precious to you, and you may have to reorganize your priorities, but the fact that you get angry is not sin. If you go out and buy a new car, and you drive it off the parking lot, and you decide to pick up some groceries on the way home with your nice new car, and you park in the parking lot, and somebody drives up next to you in a junker, and they open their car door carelessly and ram it into your brand new car, causing a dent and a scratch and whatnot, you might get angry. That car has some value to you, and this person just devalued it. That is normal. That's also a very good reason why you might want to always drive junk, because then you never have to get angry. I'm just saying. There's nothing wrong with new cars, but I drive junk as long as it runs, and the nice thing is it's paid for, the insurance is low, and I don't give a rip what happens to it. It's already falling apart. Carefreeness.